Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin Brockbank. I'm the president here at Spokane Community College, and it is my sincere pleasure to be able to welcome all of you today to this special event on behalf of all of the faculty, staff, and students at Spokane Community College. We feel incredibly fortunate to be able to welcome our speaker this morning, Ijeoma Oluo, as part of our Martin Luther King Jr. celebration. Many of us had the great experience to be able to share in reading her book, So You Want to Talk About Race, as part of the Teaching and Learning Center book club this fall. And those experiences have actually put us in a position where I think many of us are very high expectations for this event today. So on behalf of the equity leaders on campus and our executive college leadership, I want to emphasize the importance of these types of events at SCC. Something like this is a critical part of our efforts to further educate ourselves on topics that will help us make gains in our goal in developing a fully equitable campus for all SCC students. So thank you again for being an active participant today and helping to move SCC forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lori Hunt for a proper introduction of our speaker. Dr. Hunt.
Thank you, President Brockbank. Good morning. My name is Dr. Lori Hunt, and I am the Dean of Student Success at SCC. Thank you for joining. Today's event is being live streamed on YouTube and will remain available for viewing. I'd like to thank our ASL interpreters and remind those viewing that any questions for our guest speaker can be shared in the chat for the open question and answer session at the conclusion of our presentation. I wanted to start by sharing this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. People fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they do not know each other. They don't know each other because they have not communicated with each other. As we honor the life and legacy of Dr. King, it is important to acknowledge where this work began and all the work that has been done by the likes of Ida B. Wells, John Lewis, and many others who have fought against racial and social injustice. To continue this work, we have invited our guest speaker to share her insights on racial dialogue and how to move from conversations to action. Ijeoma Oluo is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, So You Want to Talk About Race, and recently released Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America. Her work on race has been featured in the New York Times and the Washington Post, among many others. She has twice been named to the Root 100, and she received the 2018 Feminist Humanist Award and the 2020 Harvard Humanist of the Year Award from the American Humanist Association. She lives in Seattle, Washington. It is my pleasure to introduce today Ijeoma Oluo.
Thank you, Lori. It's a real pleasure to be here talking with everyone. And before I got into my talk, I'm going to say I don't get to speak at a lot of community colleges, and it always makes me sad because I love community colleges, and I think that perhaps they don't always get the respect they deserve. But community college was a huge part of my pathway to where I am today. First, as a Reading Start student who definitely was not going to be able to afford full tuition as a poor, Black girl, and then later as a single parent, finishing up my associates to make the rest of my degree that I got at Western, which were accessible to me. I absolutely loved the time that I spent here in Shoreline Community College, where I got my associates. And I hope that you find that you have the resources and that you understand what an important part of this time is to your education. But that being said, let me go ahead and dive in. So I am a writer and speaker on issues of race and identity in America, and I've been doing this work for years now. And of course, my entire life, I've also been a Black woman growing up in the Pacific Northwest, which means race and gender have been a huge part of my life always. But I wrote So You Want to Talk About Race growing up in this region. And I don't know if the book would have come to be had I grown up anywhere else. There's something really specific about areas like the Pacific Northwest and how we engage, or to be more specific, refuse to engage on issues of race. These are majority white areas, as I'm sure you know, and often like to hide behind a more liberal politic. I know it is not quite the same out in Spokane, but I've been to Spokane many times and I know that there are similar elements there. And people often think that if you don't hear a racist thing, if someone isn't shouting a racial slur, if we aren't in the South, then race isn't an issue and racism is not an issue. But the truth is that there is no area of this country where systemic racism is not an issue. And the numbers bear that out. The income disparities, the health and wealth and well-being disparities across this country in pretty much every single region show a very disturbing picture when it comes to racial equity in this country. There is no way we can get to where we have the average net worth of the average Black household to be 1/11th or between 1/11th and 1/13th the net financial worth of the average white household, and the average Hispanic household having 1/11th the net financial worth of the average white household, without there being serious, deep, and wide-reaching systemic issues around race in this country. And so when I say that the Pacific Northwest helped shape my work, it's because people refuse to talk about it, because these realities exist. They exist here as they do everywhere else, and yet people were very reluctant to name it. No one would come out and tell you that you were being discriminated against because of your race or ethnicity. People would not shout the slurs that would confirm your suspicion, and yet the reality of life for people of color in the Pacific Northwest, in the West, and across the country shows that there is a problem. And so I became very observant, and I think this is where situation and skill combine. I had to be very aware of what wasn't being said and what was happening. And I have a lifelong frustration with the ways in which we refuse to talk about important issues that are impacting our lives. I started writing about race after the murder of Trayvon Martin. I was writing from a place of grief and fear and desperation, really trying to connect with people. I needed to know that the community I grew up in, that the people I worked with and considered friends could understand why this was important and why this was an issue we needed to start talking about. I was really just pleading with the people I love to see me, to see my family, and to understand why this matters. As my work started to pick up, eventually I quit my job and dedicated my life to this work. I've been writing and speaking on this issue ever since. I have traveled all over the country. So You Want to Talk About Race was my first book, and it was born out of a frustration as a writer of having to explain over and over and over again how we needed to be looking deeper at the systemic issues behind the racist incidents that we see dominating our headlines. If you write articles on issues around race, you will find that you are asked to write a think piece every time something racist happens that hits the news. But you're asked to treat it as if it's a brand new phenomenon and not part of a longer pattern. And so often you find that your essays could be pretty cut and paste, because the reason why a Black person got the cops called on them at Starbucks is the same reason why they will get the cops called on them when they're having a barbecue or opening a lemonade stand. And yet you're asked to treat it all separately instead of saying, what is happening systemically and what is happening in our society that we really need to be discussing? I also wrote this book because people were reaching out to me. They would read one of my articles and then send me an email saying, I don't know how, don't tell anyone I said this, but I don't know what intersectionality is. Or I don't understand the school to prison pipeline. I don't really know what's being discussed and how to speak on it intelligently and competently. I don't know how to be heard. And so I decided to write that book because when I looked for one like it, I couldn't find it. At the time, I couldn't find something that took the advanced race theory that has been so useful and amazing in academic circles for generations and applied it to day-to-day life. Yes, we know these terms exist. We know that privilege is a term. We know that intersectionality is a term. We hear people talk about the school to prison pipeline. We hear people say systemic racism. But what does this mean in your school? What does this mean in your workplace? What does this mean in your city government? What does it mean in your family? These are questions that I wanted to answer because I wanted to pull us out of this space of fear and frustration and ignorance and into a place of empowerment and action. And it begins with conversation. We have to talk about what's going on, but we have to do so with care. There are risks to acting like we don't have to discuss issues of race. It is really obvious this year, I think, especially since the brutal killings of unarmed Black people by the state over the summer. It is obvious now more than ever with the events we've seen this month that we need to be talking about race and racism in this country. It is embarrassing that this is what it takes to get people to realize that we have to address these issues, because racism has been impacting the lives of people of color in this country for over 400 years. But this is where we are. And so if you were debating whether or not you want to talk about this issue, it's important to understand that on your campus, there are real risks to continuing to ignore racial issues. One, subpar education, where you can't investigate the quality of education, the racial competency of education, and the accuracy of education when it comes to race and racial history. You are giving subpar education to every student, regardless of race and ethnicity. We all need to understand our whole history. We all need education that allows everyone to thrive and recognizes the contributions of all people, regardless of race or ethnicity. You are not just doing a disservice to students of color in not having racially competent education. You are doing a disservice to white students as well. And with that, we also see racist educational outcomes, whether it's success rates, and whether it's just how students of color reflect upon their education, and whether or not they decide to go on to further degrees, depending on how inclusive and safe and welcoming their educational environment is. And that leads to the next risk, which is the overall toll on students and staff of color. Predominantly white institutions are often psychologically threatening to students of color and to staff of color. These are often memories of times we had to overcome, instead of spaces where we discovered what we were capable of and where we thrived. Often for educators of color, this is time where they're trying to stretch their work between providing a nice education, an accurate education for students, and supporting students of color, while also dealing with hostile coworkers who do not value their work and do not value their lived experience as faculty of color. And finally, it's important to recognize the influence that educational institutions have on their local area, whether it's the people they employ or the tone they set in political and social discourse. It is important to recognize that what happens on campus does not stay on campus, and that often communities look toward their local campuses for moral and social guidance. And if you refuse to engage openly on issues of race, you are telling the local community that they do not need to engage on these issues either. If you don't think that you have a problem with race in your area, in your school, in your workplaces, you are wrong. If you are not hearing about issues about race and racism, chances are then that the message has been sent loud and clear to the people of color in your midst, that you are not open to hearing about it, and that this is not a safe environment for them to discuss it, and therefore they must carry that burden alone. It is not just unfair, it is cruel. It is vital that we talk about these issues and that we work towards a solution. And so I have a few tips as you start this journey. Because like I said before, it is not only important to have these conversations, it is important that we have these conversations with great care. Issues of race and racism are not academic exercises. We are talking about the lived experiences and the lived trauma of people of color. Therefore, when we are asking to have these difficult conversations, we must treat them with the respect and care necessary. So here are some tips. Number one, you need to figure out where you are. If you don't know how things look racially on your campus, if you don't know how students and staff of color are faring, you need to find out. You need to build safe and accountable ways for people to communicate how they are faring in your institution. You need to survey accurately to try to find as much information as possible. You need to find out what is being said in spaces that perhaps you do not have access to. And when I say these need to be safe and accountable, that is vital in order to get accurate information and to honor the information given. You have to give people a way to talk about what's happening without having to defend their lived experience over and over again, without fear of reprisal over, it's just something that we all learn. If you are Black or Hispanic or Native in any space and you're trying to talk about race, you often find that you are immediately met with hostility. That means it better be deadly serious before you bring it up, if you're going to risk your relationships, your career, your education for it. It is vital that instead we create a welcoming and open environment where people can talk safely, and we show true appreciation for the risk that BIPOCs take to talk about these issues. It is important that we are accountable to what is being said to us as well. I am not suggesting that we all start large group therapy sessions where we unload our feelings. I do not believe that there is a solution to be found there. The reason why we want to find out where we are is so that we can act upon it. And so that means if you were going to ask people of color to divulge painful truths in their lives that can risk their relationships, that you honor that with care and with action. It is important to center BIPOC voices in these discussions. This is one of the things that I think often is hard in an educational setting to realize, but not all contributions in conversations on race are equal. The contributions of a person of color, of a Black student, an Indigenous student, an Asian student, Hispanic student, are going to need to be centered above conversations of white people. Why? Because we have a correction to make. We have to correct the imbalance in these conversations in the past. And we also have to recognize how our privilege can make what other people are facing invisible. And this means that white privilege means that what white people are often seeing when it comes to race is a wholly inadequate picture. But because we are so used to centering whiteness, even in discussions on race, we have to be extra careful to make sure that we are really centering the experiences of people of color so that they do not feel overwhelmed and outnumbered by a white supremacist majority. It is important that we build actionable and accountable next steps. Every step of this process should be actionable and accountable. It is important not just to talk, but to say, what are we going to do with this information? And to be open and honest about what those next steps may be. It doesn't mean that you have a whole plan worked out, but it does mean that you say, this is what we're going to do with this information. This is how you will see and know that we are doing it. And this is how we will be held accountable if we fail to do these things. And it is important as you are working towards solutions on issues of race, that success is always determined by those most impacted by racial inequities. Often I find that even when institutions are working towards racial solutions, they're often their own white-centered idea of what success will be. And so they say, oh, we've listened to people of color, we know what the problem is, now we're going to move forward, and this is what we're going to do, and it's a great success. And they never actually think to circle back to the people impacted and say, is this even what you wanted? Is this what success looks like to you? And I find, especially in academia, this is often the case. There is this idea that there is a degree you can get as a white person that would give you more experience than the lived experience of people of color as to what academic success for people of color will be. But it is important to recognize that we have the right to determine what our success looks like. And not only that, but we must, if we are to undo the racism that is endemic in our school systems. The truth is that this can all be done. And I think if there's one lesson I hope that academic institutions recognize is how much rapid change they have been able to implement this past year. So often when people are asking for change when it comes to race and racial equity, they are told that it is too big of an ask, that these things must go slow, that there's only so much that an institution like a college can do. But look at what we have accomplished in this crisis in this last year. Look at how fundamentally education has changed across this country in a matter of months. If we can do this in a pandemic, why can't we do this for racial equity? It is all about will. It has never been about resources. It has never been about time. It has always been about will. And so now, in showing how rapidly we can change education, there are no more excuses left to give. I urge you now to take advantage of the new, more flexible and rapidly changing system we're in right now to inject racial equity into every phase of the work that you do. If we're going to be changing education as we know it, like we have been, why not change it for a system that is more racially equitable? I know we can do it. I believe that we can. And it is vital. We must. If we want to see an end to the unrest that we have seen this year, then we must start making real systemic, lasting change instead of just reacting to crises after crises. I look forward to the conversations that you will have and to the actions that will rise from it. I absolutely believe in you. I believe in us. I know that just like we have created some harmful and destructive systems, we can tear them apart and create systems that are healing, that help all people. And I look forward to watching that happen. All right, that's the end of my talk. And now we're gonna move to Q&A.
Thank you so much for that information. It was very wonderful, very educational, informative. And we do have a few questions that have come through. So the first question is, what are your thoughts about books that are written about race from white authors like White Fragility and how it's received by consumers?
I am of many different minds around this. Like I know Robin DiAngelo, and I think that her scholarship is very valuable. And I think especially the papers she was writing on white fragility prior to the book added a lot of really important things to the way in which we discuss race. I think there is inherent value in that. I think that it is vital when you're doing this work to be aware of your privilege and to make sure to know that you in every step of the way must be looking at how you can dismantle the systems that give you privilege over others. And so it is not enough to write a book that has other people doing work. It is important, and even in how your work is received, that you do the work as well. That being said, all of the privilege that affords, say, a book like White Fragility to sell more than pretty much every other Black writer who's writing on race has, that is bestowed upon by readers who don't want to investigate why they are so much more comfortable with a book that begins and ends in their experience on race and that is written by someone who looks like them. And so that's where I say it's about people and saying, ask for more of yourself in your work. Try to step away from a place of comfort and away from a place that centers you and your needs and your experience over and over again. But that's a cultural conversation we need to have, because even when we talk about issues of race and anti-racism, often what we center is this white journey, how you will grow and how you will become better. And it's not about you. It is about your actions, and it's about, what you need to be held accountable to. But the victory at the end of the day is not you being a better person, it's the systems being changed, right? It's rectifying the harm that you have participated in. And so I want people to look at that. And so I'd say the conversation is much deeper than what about white writers and what about their books? And I think first and foremost, I want readers to look at their expectations and why they are so much more likely to pick up a book that's not only written by a white person, but the premise of White Fragility begins and ends in whiteness. And that's an important part of the journey, but it's just one part.
Great, thank you. Next question. If you had to recommend one anti-racist strategy, what would it be?
I mean, I don't even think there is a strategy. And I hope that people understand that a lot of times, we have this idea that there's this strategy versus this without understanding it's just people coming up with things and trying things and putting them together. And we don't actually have to be in a camp. We're not talking, there's not a party of anti-racism that you need to be in. But what I would say is look at liberational ideology, right? Ideology that's not focused on making things less toxic for people of color or creating a version of whiteness for people of color, but that's looking at enabling the liberation, the ability for populations of color to determine their own destiny. And liberation, ideologies require things like the destruction of police states. And I would say that's where, if we're talking about what our ultimate goal is, I am in this for Black liberation and for liberation of populations of color. And where tactics would have us settle for something less, I still see that as an enemy of liberation. And that's really where I focus on.
How do we remember what's happened in the past 4 years to make sure that future generations know exactly what's happened, as opposed to what will be written in the history books?
That's part of the reason why I wrote my latest book, Mediocre, is because I want people to be able to put what's happening now in the context of what has been happening generation after generation. It is vital that you understand our history, especially our history towards racial terrorism, and understand how this fits, because those of us doing this work have been living with this pit in our stomachs, knowing that something like this was coming, because it's happened time and time again. And if you know your history, you know what it looks like, and you know early on what to avoid and what to speak out against. And so it is vital, if we want to remember this, that this does not go into history as a once in a lifetime event, as a standalone event, but part of a series of racial terrorism that has been, ebbing and flowing for over 400 years and really building up, since the election of Barack Obama in recent times.
Okay, thank you. How do you engage people like the ones that were involved or support the events that happened at the US Capitol in conversations about race when they can't see through the lens of BIPOC populations?
Oh, I don't. I absolutely don't. And I don't recommend it. I get, if this is your uncle, your brother, your cousin, there should always be consequences for this sort of behavior and belief. And yes, please enact those. But what's far more important to me is to recognize, even now in our response to the, violent coup attempt that we saw last week, is looking on the left, looking at people who already, have signed on and said racism is wrong, and looking at the tepid response, right? I like to point out the difference in fervor. Look at how dedicated the people showing up there are to maintaining racial oppression and power and hatred. How dedicated are we in our response to peace and democracy and equity and justice? I don't see anywhere near the same response. What I see is sadness and fear, but I don't actually see a dedication. And I don't see people having conversations and saying, okay, what does this mean systemically? How do we show that this is actually who we are? And we are more dedicated to this than the divisiveness. And so I don't think that we need to be spending all of our time with people who are more wed to hatred than we are to freedom and to equity and to peace. We need to be getting ourselves ready to match that energy with the fierce energy of love and righteousness, and we need to do that and have those conversations with each other. And that's where I think the conversations need to be had. When we do that, then we have the power to change things systemically that limits what people who are wedded to hate and destruction can do. And that is really where we're going to see the change. It's not sitting and talking to your racist uncle for hours and trying to get him to see that people of color are human beings. It's in making sure that no matter what he thinks, he doesn't have the power to act on it, right? And that's really the focus I think we need to have right now.
What do you do for self-care when you witness the events like the Capitol riot and relive past trauma, as well as the current trauma of what's on the news? How do you get from emotion to being able to write a book or persuade others?
Oh man, I mean, look, there are times where I'm just a mess. This week is been a complete mess. It's absolutely, there's no way I'm like centering and finding a way forward. I think it's important to recognize that we are human beings and that these things will affect us. And so part of my, I guess, self-care is recognizing that sometimes I need to just fall apart. And so, you know, I'm minimizing my schedule. I'm having anxiety attacks. I'm in that space and I know that, and that's a reasonable response. And so part of it is not trying to push myself through that, but to recognize that and recognizing that it's a hyper-capitalist response actually for people of color, especially, to be expected to just find a way to push through and become immediately productive, right? We are human beings. And so, you know, I canceled a lot of things on my calendar. I'm trying to build as much time to just sit and decompress as I can right now. And so I can get the strength up to keep pushing forward. And part of how I'm doing that is doing the things that often you want to pull away from in this time, reaching out to people, you know, making sure that even if I feel exhausted, that I still call a friend and talk for a few minutes and work things through. That even if I feel like I can't look away from the news, that I spend a little bit of time with my family, you know, playing a board game or something like that, and then getting back into it so that I can truly dedicate myself when I'm in that time. But I would say, especially if you're a person of color who's incredibly, you know, and also I would say a Jewish person as well, you know, watching people walk through the, you know, our Capitol with Auschwitz shirts on, is incredibly terrifying for Jewish people in this country as well. And so you're likely feeling similarly. You know, it is vital to recognize that that is a totally normal response to be in, to feel fear, to feel overwhelmed, and that we have to reach out for each other and create space for healing, and that it is not on us, you know. Part of our survival, you know, this is a terror campaign that's meant to keep us reeling, you know, and to wear us down. And so part of that means we have to reach towards each other and really center our own well-being in this time. And also to really expect more from allies and say, you have to come forth and you have to do your work now. You need to be having these conversations because it's not up to me to educate you anymore. You know what's out there, get to work. And I think that that's really vital right now.
Thank you. I really appreciate that piece and that creating space for healing. I think it is really important for allies to do the work and do the research to continue these conversations. We're getting a lot more questions. So another one, are you anti-white or do you just wish we tried harder to eliminate racism?
I mean, I don't even know what anti-white means, honestly. People ask that and they want, you know, and I know that often this is a question that sometimes people ask nicely because they want me to be able to differentiate and say there's a difference between being anti-white and this. But I think the discussion itself is a distraction because a couple of reasons. One, I don't know what it means to be anti-white. But if let's say I was like, I am anti-white, what would that mean systemically and what threat would that actually hold to whiteness? None whatsoever. So I think it's the question is a distraction because anti-Blackness is a systemic issue that actually threatens the lives of Black people in this country, right? Anti-indigeneity has contributed to the genocide and erasure of Native peoples. Anti-whiteness, I think at most shows up as someone calling someone like a cracker on the street and it ruins their day, right? There's a difference. That being said, this is an interpersonal thing for me, right? This work, I am so not at all concerned with what an individual white person thinks about me. And they should not be concerned about what I think about them. I'm talking about systems. And so I'm talking about whiteness as a political and social structure and identity and what it means. Where I live, I would say, is in the actual opposite of what people think of as anti-whiteness. I believe that whiteness itself, as a structural cultural identity, is very pessimistic about itself and its ability to grow and change and become a part of solutions on racial equity. I believe that we are all able to grow and change. I don't believe there's anything inherent to a specific race or ethnicity. And so the thought that we can't have open, honest conversations about race and that white people can see it and grow and do better, the thought that they couldn't do that, that they would fall apart, that's a conversation that comes out of whiteness. It's not coming from me, because otherwise I wouldn't do this work. And so I think it's important to recognize, I think that anyone who does this work and is engaging honestly about issues of race, any person of color who does this, has an inherent positivity about the potential of white culture that many white people don't have.
I love to see younger students and individuals participating in activism. And so a student is asking, what can I do as a white teenager to avoid systemic racism and be a real activist and not just a person who says something but does nothing?
That's a really great question. And I would say a lot of times in these discussions, we discount younger people in the environments that they're in. So one thing that I'm always trying to tell teachers and parents is, if you had a child that you knew was going to be a great engineer one day and you wanted that for them, you wouldn't send them to school and without signing them up for a math class and expect that that would happen. When we expect our young people to grow up and be actively anti-racist and productive members of society, we manage to send them through childhood and teen years without a single lesson, without any practice in active anti-racist and abolitionist work. And so it is vital that you recognize that what you're in right now is an important system that is teaching you how to be a member of public society. That what the environment you're in right now matters, and the actions you have matters, because you're setting expectations not only for yourself, for your peers, for your educators, and for your family. So treat your family like a system. What is your family system perpetrating? Treat your school like a system. What is the system of your school perpetrating? Treat your friend group like a system. What is the system of your friend group perpetrating? And figure out where you can be a part of change. What is happening on your school campus absolutely matters, and especially to students of color and faculty of color. What conversations you're having in your family absolutely matters as far as how your family acts economically, politically, and socially in this world, right? So start looking and saying, okay, what can we do as a friend group? How can I engage my teachers? How can we engage our lesson plans? What can we do to raise up voices of our peers of color? Look and start asking, what issues are affecting your peers of color in your age group right now, and figure out how you can be a part of that solution. You are, if you are a white teenager, part of the higher social stratum in your peer groups, whether you feel it or not, because it's very easy, no matter what race or ethnicity, to feel completely disempowered and to feel alone. But trust me, there is a privilege that comes with your racial identity that you can leverage to make real change. And so it starts with first looking and seeing, okay, what are my peers of color doing? Start looking up articles. What are young activists doing? What can I support? What conversations can I be having? And start having those conversations.
And on that note, another question. What are some tips for having a conversation about intersectionality?
Intersectionality is really, one of the pillars of my work. I would lose my moral compass without it. I see it's really important, first of all, to really understand what intersectionality is. And that means kind of going back to the people who made it what it is. So reading the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, or watching one of her interviews. And, she is an active academic talking and teaching and speaking today. So it is important to reference that. But understand that intersectionality, if you are not familiar with it, is basically a concept that we've long known about, even if we weren't naming it. But Dr. Crenshaw really came up with this term because she was seeing this phenomenon and looking at when we try to attack social issues, especially where she was looking at was issues facing women, that often when we refuse to look at issues of race and class and sexuality, that we ended up coming up with solutions that harmed first and foremost Black and Hispanic women. And that's where she was looking at the time. And then it was expanded to queer women of color, queer women, and other people of color. And then, but we could say the same about disability, gender, identity. And so it's basically the idea that any solutions we have to solve social issues will be at best incomplete and likely harmful to people who have other intersecting identities that are oppressed, that we're not addressing. And so what it really is for you in your day-to-day work is when you're trying to understand an issue, let's say you're reading an article about race, or you're trying to address something in your class, to look and say, who else might be impacted by this issue? And in what way? And what do I need to know when I'm looking at understanding this issue and what solutions we need to have? So it's a way of becoming more effective. A lot of times people think that intersectionality complicates things. I think it simplifies, because it's much easier when trying to understand an issue to say who all is impacted than to go halfway down your education on an issue, work towards a solution, and find out that it's actually harmful to people and you have to go back and redo. And so that's really why intersectionality is such a guiding force in my work, because I don't ever want to look and say, oh, I thought I had a solution, but I actually ended up harming a lot of vulnerable people in my work.
Thank you. Any advice for biracial folks on how to approach their white family who are not willing to reach out and try to bridge gaps?
You know, it's tough, and that's really heartbreaking. And I wrote about this. You know, I have a white mother. I've definitely written about it in So You Want to Talk About Race, for one chapter. But I would say that it's really difficult. And I would say, first and foremost, it's important to recognize that the pain you feel around that is completely valid, because there'll be a lot of people in your family, in your society, that says it's not, or that says you're the problem because you're the one who sees your racial identity, whereas others would prefer not to. And know that that's not true, that you absolutely deserve in your family to be seen as a whole person, and that your race and ethnicity is a part of who you are. And so you have every right to feel the pain and rejection that you may feel when people refuse to engage on that. And I would say, if first and foremost, recognize, do you want to build this bridge because you want this person in your life, or because there's an expectation that this person is in your life? A lot of times there's a lot of pressure in families to say, oh, you can't, you have to make amends with this person because they're your family. But you actually get to define that, because family is more than just blood. It is how we stand, even come through for each other and love each other. So first, recognize that if you're like, you know what, I can do all this work and I'm still not going to want to hang out with this person. Okay, well then let it go. Just let it go. And know that you have every right to do that. But also, it's important to recognize that your mental well-being and your mental health matters. And that a lot of times, especially when it comes to these issues, we devalue the sanity and the safety of people of color and say, no, you have to break yourself apart in order to build these connections because you're of less value. That this person doesn't actually have to do the work. They don't have to get uncomfortable. It's just you. And if you really cared, you would do that. And what that is a fundamental devaluing of who you are. So sit in your value as a person and say, I deserve to be safe for this. Now, it doesn't mean that every time that you have these gaps, it's that you're going to want to throw it away. There will be people that you genuinely love in your life that you would love to stay connected to. And that this is a real gap, because the truth is that we all have this racial programming. And so some people who love you dearly may not be able to see and the harm that they are causing. And so I would say, what I would offer up to them, this is what I would say, if you genuinely decide you want this, figure out first on your own what it would look like to have a healthy relationship with this person. What would it mean? How would they hear you? How would they see you? How would you communicate with them? What would the end result be if you worked through this? Really build that image up and then offer that to them. A lot of times people get really wary because they think if we start talking about race, you're going to find out how much we have, what I've done wrong. I'm going to feel bad. We're going to end up further apart, and so people avoid it. And so if instead you say, this is a relationship I want with you. This is what's at the end of us doing this work. And I think we can get there. But it means we're going to have some painful discussions to get there, to set aside these issues, to work through these issues, to have a plan to continue these conversations, offer that vision and see if they want to join you. And sometimes people will jump at that chance because they didn't know it was possible. What they thought was you were going to have a conversation, they were going to feel bad, and it was never going to get solved. But offering up a vision for what it means on the other side of that can help. And sometimes, unfortunately, people will say, I don't want that. But then and you can let it go, And so that's really the tactic I find often. If you want to figure out if you can move forward, has a better chance.
Thank you. What would you say to someone who relates what happened at the Capitol building to the Black Lives Matter protest that took place this summer?
I have no desire to say anything to them. I think people overestimate. Yes, I wrote a book called So You Want to Talk About Race, but there are things that are deliberate. There are things that are deliberate, right? With the information we have, everyone knows that there is a difference between storming a Capitol building and threatening the lives of elected officials and marching in the streets because Black people are being murdered by police. There is a huge difference. There's even a big difference between setting a Starbucks on fire and storming a federal Capitol building. Like, there's a huge difference. And I'm not going to pretend like it's something we need to debate, so I don't. I think we do a real harm by pretending like these are debatable things. What we do then is we legitimize it and say, oh, if I don't win you over, it's not valid. No, you're a smart human being and you know what you're doing and you're trying to distract and deflect, and I'm not going to give it space. And I think that we do a huge harm. I mean, look at even right now in the impeachment hearings, the harm done by having these debates on the national stage of whether or not active coup attempts and sedition are wrong, right? Like, what? So, I just don't. And I think we need to recognize that. There is this weird thing, I think, about whiteness, which is this idea that instead of focusing on solving systemic problems, that every white person is so valuable that we must win over every individual person. No, we can say this is unacceptable. You don't have to agree. It's unacceptable. And I'm not going to debate you whether, if someone walks up and punches me in the face, I'm not going to have a debate with them about whether or not it's acceptable for them to punch me in the face. It's unacceptable, right? And me going, well, let's talk about this. You think it's fine. No, all that does is legitimizes this really bonkers idea, right? And that's kind of what we're doing right now. So I would say, let go of the thought that you have to win over every racist out there. You have to bring everyone over. You don't have to. Sometimes you can just let people sit in their ignorance and try to work to minimize the harm they can do.
And the last question, who do you look up to for inspiration, and what activists, writers, etc., have made an influence on your life?
Oh my goodness. I mean, so many people. You can't do this work and write on these issues without spending a ton of time in the work of others. I am, regularly inspired. I'm inspired by, ancestors, by the work of forebears. I'm inspired by the work of Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde. I'm in James Baldwin. I'm inspired by the contemporary work of Janaea Khan, Patrisse Cullors. The work of the squad that we have working Capitol Hill right now, even the work of Pramila, the longtime work of Pramila Jayapal here. I'm inspired by young people who are out in the streets and writing and challenging me with a lot of new ideas. I think that there is endless, our history is one of perseverance amongst, great hardship, and every generation, everywhere we look, we're going to see incredible inspiration to be had. I'm also really inspired by creatives of color who are out creating beauty in the midst of all of this as well. There's just everywhere you turn, there's people to be inspired by. And, sometimes I'm inspired by a piece I read. Sometimes I'll be inspired by just moments of Black joy and recognizing that we're still prioritizing that and making space for that even in the midst of all of this.
So if there's been some great conversation on YouTube, in the chats, I'm loving seeing it, but we are almost out of time. And so how can people continue to engage with you in conversation, or what's the best way to, follow you to learn more?
Yeah, everything is under my name. I figure my name is unusual for people. You learn my name, you shouldn't have to learn any other things if you want to find me. So on everywhere I exist on social, it's under Ijeoma Oluo. That's Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I don't know how any of the other things work because I'm 40. Email, it's ijeoma@ijeomaoluo.com. So, but usually anything event I'm doing, you're going to find about it on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, and you'll find thoughts there. And you can also see who I follow, on Twitter, especially. Instagram, you're just going to find a lot of makeup accounts, but Twitter, you're going to find a lot of places, where I engage with people as well, if you're interested on looking for some other voices to look towards.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time and valuable insight on race and these discussions that we need to continue having. Before we go, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the SCC and SFCC Black Student Unions, the SCC President's Office, the SCC Hagen Center for the Humanities, SCC Peace Studies, and SCC Student Awareness League. We invite you to join the SCC Hagen Center Winter and Spring Speaker Series, Diversity Dialogues, Conversations about Race and Equity. These events are listed on our website at scc.spokane.edu/Hagen Center. The next event will be Wednesday, January 20th with author Marlon James. Thank you everyone for joining us and have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Thank you.